another grammar point with me, Teacher Katie. In these videos, we dive into the details of English grammar to see how it works. Let's get started. So, let's review what we watched in part 1. In part 1, we talked about positive and negative comparisons. And if you haven't yet seen it, I recommend going back and watching that video. We compared today and yesterday using a positive comparison, saying today is as cold as yesterday. And we used the as adjective as grammar construction. With our negative comparison, we compared Texas and Minnesota, and we used our negative comparison, not as adjective as, saying that Texas is not as cold as, or in other words, less cold than Minnesota. And remember, we talked about that does not equal sign kind of working more like a less than sign. So, today in this video, we're going to talk about adding adverbs. What do adverbs do? Well, similar to adjectives, adverbs modify or change something. But in this case, adverbs modify verbs, adjectives, and other adverbs. So, here's an example. He is tall. We could use an adverb to say he is very tall, modifying our adjective tall. So, today we're going to be looking at adding 4 adverbs to our as adjective as grammar construct. Those adverbs are just, almost, nearly, and quite. Now I do want you to be careful with this last word. My students often confuse the following 3 words. Quite, spelled I-T-E, which is the adverb that we'll be using today. Quiet, spelled I-E-T, which is an adjective meaning not loud. And quit, spelled I-T, which is a verb that means to stop. So, remember, today we're going to be using the first word on that list, quite. So now, let's learn how these adverbs can modify or change our comparisons with as. So here are our 3 ways of making comparisons. We have the equal sign, or the positive comparison that we talked about in the last video. We use that with as adjective as. And here I've got a picture of 2 sisters. You can see I could use as tall as. The girl is as tall as her sister. But if I want to add one of those adverbs to add emphasis, I could use the word just. And I could say the girl is just as tall as her sister, meaning equal. So in our chart here today, you can see I've added just as adjective as under our positive comparisons. And I have my 2 example sentences. The girl is as tall as her sister, and the girl is just as tall as her sister. Now let's look at another form of making comparisons. We're going to look at this squiggly equal sign, also known as the approximate sign, or almost equals to. So if we think about it in a math, 0.999 is almost equal to 1. It's about or approximately 1. So here I've got 2 little boys, they're brothers, and you can see that the boy on the right, the one with blonde hair, he's almost as tall as his brother. So in this case, I could use the adverb almost, and I could say the blonde-haired boy is almost as tall as his brother. I do have another choice that means the same thing. I could use the adverb nearly. The blonde-haired boy is nearly as tall as his brother. Both of these sentences mean the same thing. So in our approximate comparison column, we have 2 options, almost as or nearly as adjective as. And here are our 2 example sentences from before. Now let's look at our 3rd form, the negative comparison. So again, that's kind of like in math when we're saying 2 things are not equal. So here I've got three sisters. We'll call the one on the left Jasmine, the one in the middle Alexis, and the one on the right Haley. And I've put some bars here to help you see their height differences. So, if we use that negative comparison that we've learned in the first video, we could say not as adjective as. So I could say Jasmine and Alexis are not as tall as Haley. In the same way, I could just say one name at a time. I could say Jasmine is not as tall as Haley and Alexis is not as tall as Haley. But I'm just putting them both together in the subject because both of them are not as tall as Haley. Now I do have another option, not quite as. So I'm using that word quite. I could say Alexis is not quite as tall as Haley. I also have another option, not nearly as. So I could say Jasmine is not nearly as tall as Haley. Now, what's the difference between these two? Do they mean exactly the same thing as in our other comparison with almost and nearly? Well, let's look closer at these two sentences. Alexis, she's closer in height to Haley. There's only a small difference between their height. But Jasmine has a larger difference between her height and Haley's height. So it's a bigger comparison or a bigger difference. Looking again at the girl's height, we can see that there's a difference between Alexis and Haley's height, but that difference is not as big as the difference between Jasmine and Haley's height. So these adverbs, not quite and not nearly, help us know if the difference is big or small. So, as we can see, Alexis is not quite as tall as Haley shows a small difference, so we use not quite as to show that a difference is small. And in our second sentence, Jasmine is not nearly as tall as Haley, we use not nearly as to show that the difference is big. So if I fill in my chart here, you can see I've added to my negative comparison column not as adjective as, not quite as, and also not nearly as. So, just like before, these two here, the approximate comparison and the negative comparison, work more like a less than sign. So it is important which person or which object or noun we put first. So remember, when we make approximate or negative comparisons, we must always put the lesser noun first as the subject and the greater noun as the object. So remember, in the case of the two boys, the blonde-haired boy was less tall, so he needs to go as our subject. And in the negative comparison, when I compare Alexis and Jasmine with Haley, they are less tall than Haley, so they need to go as the subject of the sentence. Now it's time to do some practice. When we do practice in these videos, there are 4 steps. First, you need to pause the video. Then you should get a notebook and write down your answers to the questions. After you've answered all of the questions, play the video again and check your answers with me. Here are 5 circles. I want you to pause the video and answer the sentences, completing them with just as, almost as, nearly as, not quite as, or not nearly as. Now I've drawn some lines to help you better with the comparisons. So go ahead, pause the video and answer the questions in your notebook. Now it's time to check your answers. Let's look at sentence number 1. Circle B is just as large as circle C. Number 2, circle E is not nearly as large as circle A. We use not nearly because it's a very large or big difference. In sentence 3, you can see we have not quite as large because circle D has a small difference from circle C. So we're using quite. Now, we could also use almost as or nearly as. These also show a small difference. If I use not quite as, I'm thinking about it in a negative way. So I'm thinking about how it doesn't measure up and how it isn't large enough. But if I use almost as or nearly as, the approximate comparison, I'm kind of thinking of it more optimistically or more positively because I'm thinking about how close they are in size. Now let's take a look at sentence 4. Circle D is not nearly as large as circle A. And again, we're using not nearly because the difference in their size is a big difference. Finally, sentence number 5, circle E is not quite as large as circle D. And again, we could use almost as or nearly as in addition to not quite as. So again, if we use not quite as, we are thinking about it negatively. We're saying that it's got a small difference, but again, we're focusing on the difference. Whereas if we use almost as or nearly as, we're focusing on how they are similar. Okay, it's time to do some extended practice. I've got a picture of a family here, and I'd like you to make sentences using those adverbs, just, almost, quite, and nearly, comparing members of the family. So you could talk about how tall or how short they are in comparison with each other, how old or how young, how dark or how light their hair is, or how good looking they are. So there are 5 family members, so I'd like you to write 5 sentences in total, and remember to use those adverbs when you write the sentences. Thanks for watching. This has been a Grammar Point with me, Teacher Katie. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them below. And remember, if you're currently taking one of the courses, please submit your answers to the extended practice section using the link that was provided to you at the beginning of your course session. That's all for now, and until next time, keep practicing English!